At 17, I came home to an empty house. My family had moved 2 states away without me, leaving only a note that said, "You'll figure it out." And years later, they showed up at my door, asking if we could be a family again. The day had started like any other, with me dragging my backpack across the cracked pavement of our street, headphones in, trying to drown out the monotony of small-town life. But the moment I opened the front door, the air shifted. The smell of home-cooked meals, the clutter of my siblings' toys, even the faint hum of the old refrigerator. It was all gone. My heart stumbled as my eyes scanned the barren living room, the empty shelves, the silent walls. It wasn't just quiet. It was hollow. I dropped my bag with a thud, the sound echoing far too loudly in the stripped-down house. Panic rose in my chest as I rushed from room to room, each one emptier than the last. No photos on the walls, no beds, no clothes. Just a shell where my family once lived. The bathroom cabinet was bare, the closets gutted, even the junk drawer, our catch-all for rubber bands and batteries, was cleared out. They hadn't just left. They had erased themselves. For a moment, my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. Maybe they were remodeling? Maybe this was some elaborate joke? I sprinted to the kitchen, hoping for some sign of normalcy, and that's when I saw it. A single piece of lined notebook paper sitting on the counter. 4 words, scrawled in my mother's handwriting. "You'll figure it out." My hands trembled as I picked it up, reading and rereading, trying to make sense of the cruelty hidden in the simplicity. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My knees buckled and I sank onto the cold kitchen tiles, clutching the note like it might magically explain itself if I held it tighter. Memories of family dinners, birthdays, laughter, they all crashed into me, shattering under the weight of abandonment. I was 17, barely old enough to vote, not even old enough to rent an apartment on my own. And yet, in their eyes, I was disposable. I stumbled outside, desperate for answers, scanning the driveway where our rusty minivan used to sit, empty. The neighbors' houses stared back at me with closed curtains, cars parked neatly in their driveways. Hadn't anyone seen them leave? I knocked on Mrs. Harris's door across the street, voice shaking as I asked if she knew where my family had gone. She frowned, looked uncomfortable, and muttered something about them moving quickly before shutting the door. The pity in her eyes said it all. She knew, but she wasn't going to help. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, when I realized I had nowhere to go. My stomach growled, but the cupboards inside were bare. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but not with a message from my family. No call, no text. Just silence. They hadn't even bothered to tell me where they were headed. 2 states away, the neighbors had whispered. 2 states away, and not a single thought about the child they left behind. I tried to sleep that night on the floor of my empty bedroom, using my backpack as a pillow, but every creak of the house sent shivers down my spine. I was alone in every sense of the word. No bed, no food, no family. Just a note that felt less like an explanation and more like a sentence. My mind spiraled. Had I done something to deserve this? Had I been too difficult, too needy, too unlovable? Morning came, but it didn't bring clarity. I dragged myself to school, hoping maybe someone had answers. Maybe a teacher had heard something. But when I walked into the building, nothing had changed. Students laughed in the hallways, teachers shuffled papers, the world kept spinning while mine had collapsed. And I kept the note tucked in my pocket, a cruel reminder that the people who were supposed to love me most had decided I was on my own. That day stretched into weeks of confusion and anger. I replayed every interaction with my family, every argument, every cold silence, searching for a clue that this was coming. But the truth settled in like a weight on my chest. They hadn't left by mistake. They hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen to abandon me, and they believed that 4 words, "You'll figure it out," were enough to excuse it. In that moment, as reality clawed its way into me, I felt something shift. The pain was sharp, unbearable even, but buried beneath it was something else. A spark. If they thought I'd crumble, if they thought I'd be nothing without them, I would prove them wrong. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know where I'd find the strength. But I swore, sitting in that empty house with their note burning in my hand, that I would survive. And one day, they would regret leaving me behind. Growing up, my family looked normal from the outside. A father who worked long hours, a mother who stayed busy with church groups and community events, Two younger siblings who filled the house with constant noise. We had birthday parties with store-bought cakes, Christmas mornings full of wrapping paper chaos, and family portraits that made us look picture perfect. But behind those frozen smiles, there were cracks I was too young to see clearly. There was always an unspoken hierarchy in our house. My younger brother, the golden child, could do no wrong. My sister, the baby, was pampered endlessly. And me, the eldest, I was expected to be responsible, to set an example, to shoulder burdens without complaint. If I came home with an A, it was expected. If my siblings brought home a B, it was celebrated like a miracle. I told myself it didn't matter, that this was just how families worked. At the dinner table, conversations often turned into subtle competitions. Who had the funniest story? Who had the best grades? My parents didn't realize that their small comparisons added up, carving invisible lines between us. When my brother forgot his chores, Dad laughed it off. When I forgot, I was accused of being lazy or selfish. Still, I clung to the belief that beneath the unfairness, there was love. Families fought, but they also forgave. That's what I told myself. Holidays carried the same duality. My mother would decorate the house with perfection, every wreath and ribbon placed just so. We would sing carols, exchange gifts, and smile for the camera. But later, when the guests had left, the tension would return. My father's sharp tone, my mother's weary sighs, my siblings hiding behind me whenever something went wrong. I became the shield, the buffer, the one who absorbed the weight so they didn't have to. Looking back, I can see how conditioned I was to accept less. I believed my role in the family was to be dependable, to sacrifice without question. I didn't rebel when they pushed me harder than the others. I didn't protest when my achievements went unnoticed. I kept believing that if I was patient enough, if I kept loving them through the disappointments, one day they'd see me not as the extra burden but as part of the family worth keeping. Even in quiet moments, there were signs I chose to ignore. The way my parents sometimes spoke about me in the third person, like I wasn't really in the room. The way plans were sometimes made without asking if I could join. I thought it was normal. Every family had favorites. Every family had blind spots. What mattered, I believed, was that at the end of the day, we were still together under one roof. That was supposed to mean something. There were flashes of closeness, too. Nights when my siblings and I whispered in the dark, plotting silly adventures or sharing secrets. Moments when my mother would sit at the edge of my bed, brushing my hair and telling me everything would be okay. Those glimpses of warmth kept me holding on. They made me believe the cracks weren't fatal, just imperfections and something solid. School was my escape, but it also highlighted the distance between me and them. Teachers praised me for responsibility, friends leaned on me for advice, yet at home, my worth seemed invisible. I worked part-time jobs to save for college, but my parents never asked how I managed it. They just assumed I could handle it, the same way they assumed I could handle everything else. Still, I didn't hate them. Resentment simmered, yes, but love was stronger, or so I thought. I loved my siblings fiercely, protected them when I could. I wanted my parents' approval, craved their recognition. I told myself the struggles were temporary, that families weren't perfect. Even when I felt like an outsider, I believed blood meant something unshakable. I had no reason to think otherwise. That's why the note, "You'll figure it out," cut so deeply. It wasn't just abandonment. It was proof that the cracks I had ignored, excused, and patched over weren't cracks at all. They were fractures, growing silently until they split the entire foundation apart. And I had been too blind or too hopeful to see it coming. The day it happened began like any other. I remember walking home from school with a backpack heavy from textbooks and an even heavier heart from teenage worries. Nothing in the air suggested catastrophe. The streets were quiet, the autumn leaves crunching under my shoes. I remember thinking about an upcoming exam and whether my parents would notice if I passed with top marks. When I turned onto our street, I noticed something off immediately. Our driveway was empty. Both cars gone. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe they had gone shopping or taken the kids somewhere fun without telling me. But the closer I got to the house, the stranger it felt. Curtains that were usually drawn back hung loose and uneven, like someone had yanked them hastily. A faint echo of emptiness seemed to seep through the walls. Still, I fumbled for my keys, certain I was imagining things. I wasn't. The moment I opened the door, the silence hit me like a physical blow. The house was hollow. The furniture was gone. Not just moved, gone. The living room where we had watched movies was stripped bare, only dust outlines left where the couch and table had been. The kitchen counters gleamed, but the appliances had vanished. Even the family photos that once crowded the walls were absent, leaving pale rectangular shadows on the paint. It was like my family had been erased in one sweeping motion. I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "Mom, Dad?" Nothing. I ran from room to room, opening doors with growing panic. My siblings' bedrooms were stripped, the colorful posters torn down, their clothes removed. Even my own room had been emptied, though not as thoroughly. A few scattered notebooks, an old blanket, and one pillow sat abandoned, like afterthoughts. That's when I saw it, the note on the kitchen counter. 3 words scrawled in my father's handwriting. "You'll figure it out." Neighbors came outside when they saw me standing there, trembling on the porch with the note in my hand. They looked confused, even guilty, like they knew something I didn't. One elderly neighbor asked if I needed help. Another shook his head, muttering that families had their reasons. Their words barely reached me through the ringing in my ears. The realization sank in slowly, terrifyingly. They hadn't been taken. They had left. Left me. I searched for clues like a detective in my own life. I checked the mailbox, the garage, the backyard. Nothing. No forwarding address, no message on the phone, no explanation tucked away in some hidden corner. Just absence. I even walked the neighborhood for hours, hoping maybe I'd catch them driving back, that this was all some twisted misunderstanding. But as the streetlights flickered on, reality grew darker. They were gone, and they hadn't cared enough to look back. The hunger hit me next. Dinner wasn't waiting, no food left behind. The fridge was unplugged, shelves stripped. I sat on the kitchen floor clutching that note, my stomach twisting, not just from hunger, but from the sickening thought that my family had decided collectively that I was disposable. I replayed every moment of the last week, searching for signs. A harsh word from my father, my mother's distracted smile, my siblings' whispers. Nothing had screamed goodbye. Yet here I was, alone in a house that was no longer home. That night, I didn't sleep. I curled up on the floor of my empty room, surrounded by shadows that felt heavier than walls. Every creak made me jump. Every gust of wind through the window made me imagine footsteps that weren't there. My mind raced with questions. Was it my fault? Did I disappoint them so badly that they couldn't bear to keep me? Or was I simply never loved at all, tolerated until it was convenient to cut me loose? The silence gave no answers. The following morning was worse. Sunlight streamed through windows that used to warm a family breakfast, but now illuminated only dust and emptiness. I realized then that this wasn't temporary. They weren't coming back. They had chosen to start over 2 states away, or maybe further, without me. And I was expected to figure it out, like survival at 17 was just another test I should ace. The betrayal stung sharper with every passing minute, turning disbelief into grief, and grief into anger. That was the day childhood ended for me. In one cruel act, my family had taken away not just my home, but my sense of belonging. I wasn't just left behind, I was erased. Neighbors avoided eye contact, and no relatives came rushing to explain. I stood in the ruins of what used to be my life, holding on to nothing but a scrap of paper and the unbearable weight of abandonment. It was the beginning of a survival I hadn't chosen, but one that would shape everything that came after. The first week after they left was the hardest. At 17, I had no roadmap for survival, no adult guiding hand, no savings beyond a crumpled $20 bill in my backpack. The empty house felt less like a shelter and more like a cruel reminder that I had been abandoned deliberately. Nights were the worst, lying awake with an empty stomach, listening to the creaks and moans of a house that once held laughter but now sounded like a tomb. I clung to the thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd come back. But as days stretched on, that hope dissolved into raw survival instinct. Food became my first enemy. With the fridge stripped bare and no money for groceries, I scavenged. I stretched packets of crackers and an old jar of peanut butter I found wedged behind a cupboard. I rationed water and sometimes walked to the gas station a few blocks away, pretending I was just a kid buying snacks when really it was the only meal I'd eat that day. Hunger clawed at me constantly, sharpening my awareness of just how fragile life was when you had no one to lean on. When the neighbors realized my family wasn't returning, their pity quickly turned cold. A few gave me leftovers at first, handing them over with awkward glances, as though kindness might tether them to responsibility. But soon whispers started. "It's not our problem. The parents must have had a reason." One woman flat out. told me she wouldn't help because she didn't want to get dragged into family drama. The betrayal of community stung almost as much as my family's abandonment. I wasn't just alone, I was invisible. Desperation pushed me into odd jobs. I mowed lawns for $5, swept porches, cleaned garages, anything that bought me enough to grab a sandwich or pay for the bus. Each dollar was survival currency, a reminder that I couldn't afford mistakes. Sometimes people took advantage, promising to pay and never handing over the money. Each scam hardened me, made me sharper, more cautious. I learned to swallow pride, to ask for what I needed, to fight for scraps of dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip me bare. School became both a refuge and a battlefield. On the outside, I kept up the illusion of normalcy. Homework turned in, attendance maintained, the occasional smile to deflect questions. But inside, I was unraveling. Teachers noticed my exhaustion, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I'd linger after class just to avoid going home. A few asked gentle questions, but when I gave vague answers, they didn't push. Maybe they thought I was just another troubled teen. None of them guessed the truth, that I was sleeping on an empty floor and rationing food like a castaway. The loneliness was suffocating. Friends, the few I had, didn't understand. When I hinted at the truth, their faces twisted with disbelief. Your family wouldn't just leave. Are you exaggerating? Their doubt hurt more than their silence, and soon I stopped confiding in anyone. It was easier to keep the secret than to be met with suspicion or pity. So I built walls around myself, learning to carry the burden alone, because clearly no one else was willing to share it. Still, somewhere in the chaos, resilience began to take root. Each odd job I completed, each night I survived alone, was proof that I could endure. I discovered a grit I hadn't known I possessed. When I fixed a broken bike chain for a kid and earned enough for a week's worth of bread, it felt like victory. When I patched a leaky roof for a neighbor who actually paid fairly, I realized that skill, not sympathy, was my ticket forward. Survival wasn't just about scraping by, it was about carving strength from scarcity. There were nights, though, when the weight threatened to crush me. Nights when I stared at the ceiling and replayed every laugh, every hug, every memory of the family that had chosen to walk away. The betrayal burned hot, but beneath it was an ache that words could never capture, the longing for belonging, for someone to say, "You matter." Tears came silently then, swallowed before morning, because I couldn't afford to break down when every ounce of energy was needed for the next day's survival. Slowly, I stopped expecting rescue. No cavalry was coming, no apology letter would arrive in the mail. It was a bitter pill, but it gave me clarity. If I was going to survive, I had to stop looking back at the door they slammed shut and start building my own. Independence wasn't a choice, it was a demand. And though I hadn't asked for this cruel initiation, I was beginning to see that surviving it would make me unbreakable. By the end of that year, I wasn't the same 17-year-old who had walked home to find an empty house. I was harder, yes, but also sharper, more capable. I had learned how to live with less, how to stretch nothing into something, how to keep my head above water in a sea determined to drown me. My scars were invisible, but they were shaping me. And deep down, beneath the hunger, the loneliness, the exhaustion, there was a growing fire, a determination not just to survive, but to prove to the world and to the family who left me that I could thrive without them. Bitterness became my secret fuel. Every rejection, every night I went hungry, every look of disbelief from people who thought I was lying about my family, it all hardened into resolve. If they wanted me broken, they'd have to watch me rise instead. The words on that note, "You'll figure it out," repeated in my head like a dare. I decided I would figure it out, not just to survive, but to become someone they could never touch again. I buried myself in schoolwork, pouring every ounce of anger and hurt into grades, assignments, and exams. While others partied, I stayed late in libraries, highlighting every line until my eyes blurred. Teachers began to notice the shift, not the tired, broken kid who stumbled into class, but the one who refused to give anything less than excellence. My notebooks became a map out of the pit they had thrown me into. Each A felt like a small act of defiance against abandonment. Work became the second half of my life. I juggled jobs no teenager should have to, washing dishes until my hands cracked, stocking shelves past midnight, tutoring younger kids for spare change. The exhaustion was crushing, but I wore it like armor. Every paycheck, however small, wasn't just money. It was proof that I didn't need them. I bought my own food, paid my own bills, and when I could finally afford a mattress for the empty floor, I celebrated it like a throne. There were moments of near collapse, when the weight seemed unbearable, but then I would remember the hollow ache of that abandoned house. The image of their car disappearing without me kept me upright. Rage and grief twined together, but instead of consuming me, they sharpened me. I started keeping a mental list, not of revenge, but of milestones. Each one I achieved, passing an exam, paying rent, saving $100, was another line on the ledger proving I was stronger than what they did. Scholarships became my obsession. I researched them late into the night, scribbling application essays with blistered fingers. Every rejection stung, but every acceptance fueled me further. When I finally secured a scholarship that could carry me beyond my hometown, it felt like oxygen flooding into lungs that had been suffocating for years. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building a ladder out of the darkness. Still, bitterness never fully left. At times it threatened to poison me. I would catch myself imagining what I'd say if I ever saw them again, imagining their shocked faces when they realized the person they abandoned had made it without them. But I refused to let spite be my only legacy. I wanted more than survival, more than revenge. I wanted a life so full, so successful that their absence was nothing but a footnote. Sacrifice became routine. I skipped meals to save for books, wore shoes with holes until the soles gave out, and passed up every temptation to slack off. People my age laughed about freedom, road trips, and summer breaks, while I lived on instant noodles and double shifts. But I didn't care. Freedom for me wasn't about fun. It was about never again being at someone else's mercy. It was about carving independence so deep that no one could ever abandon me again. Support trickled in too, though quietly. A kind teacher who slipped me extra supplies, a boss who gave me extra hours when I needed them, a classmate who shared their lunch without asking questions. Small kindnesses, but they stitched up the cracks in me just enough to keep me going. They reminded me that not everyone left, not everyone turned away. Some people chose to stand beside you, even if only in fleeting moments. As years passed, that relentless drive paid off. I graduated near the top of my class, accepted into a program I once thought was out of reach. My hands shook when I read the acceptance letter. It wasn't just an academic win, it was vindication. It was proof that all the nights of hunger, all the shifts that blurred into dawn, all the sacrifices had forged something stronger than pain. By then, I had stopped asking why they left. The question no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had turned their cruelty into fuel, that I had built a foundation out of ashes. Bitterness still lingered, yes, but it no longer owned me. Drive had taken over. And though scars remained, they served as reminders of where I came from, and how far I was willing to go to prove that I didn't just survive abandonment. I transcended it. By my late 20s, I had shaped myself into someone almost unrecognizable from the abandoned teenager staring at an empty house. I had a career that demanded respect, one I carved out through sweat, sacrifice, and relentless determination. People who met me now saw the confident professional, the one who stood tall in meetings and spoke with authority, but none of them knew the jagged scars beneath. My past wasn't gone. It was embedded in me, but I wore it like hidden armor. Every achievement came with an echo of the past. Signing the lease for my own apartment felt like a victory no one could take away. Buying my first car, watching it gleam in the sunlight, felt like proof I had rebuilt from nothing. These were milestones most people take for granted, but for me, they carried weight. Each key, each signature, each step forward was a reminder. I made it. I am no longer the abandoned child they left behind. Though success surrounded me, the wound never fully healed. Some nights I would wake in a cold sweat, convinced I'd hear the silence of that empty house again, the note mocking me from the counter. The old questions, why wasn't I worth staying for, why didn't they want me, still crept in. But now, instead of breaking me, those questions fueled me to be more present in the life I had built, to never abandon myself the way they had abandoned me. Relationships were the hardest. Trust didn't come easy after being discarded like luggage. Friends had to prove themselves over years, not months. Romances came and went, but eventually I let someone in who saw me for more than my scars. Building a family of my own wasn't easy. It took time, patience, and letting go of the belief that love was always conditional. But when I looked at the people who chose to stay, I knew I had already rewritten my story. At work, I thrived. Every promotion, every new responsibility became another brick in the fortress I built against my past. My colleagues admired my resilience, though they didn't know its roots. They thought I was driven by ambition. They didn't know it was born from abandonment. Still, I let them think it was ambition, because in a way, it was. I had turned my bitterness into power, and I wasn't about to let anyone reduce me to my pain. In my quiet moments, though, I still felt the ghost of that teenager. I'd see a kid walking home from school with a backpack too big for their shoulders, and my heart would clench. I'd think of the boy or girl I once was, standing in front of an empty house, trying to figure out how to survive. I wanted to reach back in time and tell them, "You'll be okay. It won't be easy, but you'll make it farther than you can imagine." Holidays were complicated. While others gathered with their families, I created my own traditions. Sometimes that meant inviting friends who had nowhere to go. Other times it meant celebrating alone with a glass raised to the person I had become. Loneliness lingered at the edges, but it was softened by gratitude. I wasn't empty anymore. My life had meaning, even if the ones who should have shared it had chosen to walk away. Still, success didn't erase the longing completely. There were moments when I saw families laughing together, and I felt a pang of grief for what was stolen. But I reminded myself that grief was proof I had loved once, even if that love wasn't returned. It was proof I was human, not broken. And more importantly, it was proof that I could still choose to give love, even after being denied it. In building a new identity, I learned boundaries. I didn't need to forgive to move on, and I didn't need reconciliation to find peace. My strength came from acceptance, of my past, of the pain, and of the life I had built in spite of it all. I no longer saw myself as a victim of abandonment, but as the architect of survival. My story was not about what they did to me, it was about what I did afterward. By the time I looked at myself in the mirror at 28, I didn't see the abandoned teenager anymore. I saw resilience, determination, and quiet triumph. I had created a life where I was safe, respected, and loved by those who chose me. The wound still existed, yes, but it was no longer a weakness. It was part of the foundation. I had built strength around it, turning it into the core of the person I had become, unbreakable. It came without warning, like a storm breaking over a clear sky. One evening, while scrolling through emails after a long day at work, I saw the name that once defined my entire childhood. My heart stuttered, fingers freezing above the keyboard. For years, I had trained myself to live without them, to erase the reflex of hoping for their return. And yet, here it was, a message from the very people who vanished without a word. The tone was casual, almost unnervingly so. "It's been a long time," the message began, as if decades of silence could be brushed aside like a minor misunderstanding. They spoke of reconnecting, of how family bonds were stronger than mistakes, of wanting to start fresh. And buried within those words, like a splinter hidden in soft flesh, was the real reason. They needed help. Financial help. At first, I didn't know what to feel. My chest tightened, my throat closed. Anger, grief, disbelief, every emotion collided in me, sharp and overwhelming. For so many years, I had replayed that day of abandonment in my head, begging for some explanation. And now, instead of answers, instead of remorse, I was met with entitlement. They hadn't reached out to apologize, but to ask what I could do for them. The email was polite, almost warm in tone, but I read every sentence like an accusation. They spoke of hardships, of being unfortunate victims of circumstance. They reminisced about old memories, painting our past in rosy hues that ignored the brutal reality of their departure. They wanted me to remember the laughter, the Sunday meals, the family outings, conveniently skipping over the moment they walked away. For hours, I sat staring at the screen, torn between deleting the message and answering it. My instincts screamed to cut the cord, to protect the life I had built. But a quieter part of me, the wounded child still sitting in that empty house, longed to reply. To demand why? To ask if they ever thought of me in the years I wandered the world alone. To see if any shard of love remained. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, memories churned, rising like smoke from a fire I thought I had long extinguished. Their faces, once blurry with time, sharpened with cruel clarity. I heard their laughter again, felt the sting of their absence, remembered the hollowness of those first nights alone. And with every memory came a bitter truth. They had chosen silence until it became convenient to speak. The next day, I read the message again. This time I noticed the undertones of expectation. They didn't just want connection, they assumed it. As if blood ties were enough to excuse the years of abandonment. As if I owed them simply because we shared a name. The casual entitlement stung more than the absence ever did. It wasn't love they sought, it was access. To my life, my resources, my success. I imagined replying with rage, typing out every scar they had left on me. I pictured crafting a letter so sharp it would slice through their illusions of innocence. But then I thought of the power that would give them, the power to reopen wounds I had fought so hard to heal. I realized they weren't reaching out to heal me. They were reaching out to use me. And suddenly my anger turned cold, almost serene. Still, I couldn't deny the ache in my chest. To know they lived all this time, knowing where I was, knowing how to reach me, yet choosing silence until their need outweighed their pride, that knowledge hurt more than the original abandonment. It wasn't just that they left. It was that they stayed gone until I became useful. And that truth settled heavy in my bones. I didn't reply that day. I didn't reply for a week. Their message remained in my inbox, a haunting ghost of the life I had buried. Every time I logged in, it stared back at me, daring me to act. But I knew one thing for certain. No matter what I decided, this message had changed something in me. The past I had forced into silence had found its voice again, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to listen. When I finally agreed to meet them, it wasn't out of longing, it was out of necessity. The unanswered email had become a weight I carried every day, gnawing at me until I couldn't breathe. I needed closure, if not reconciliation. So I chose a neutral cafe, far from my home, far from any place that carried our shared memories. I sat there early, hands trembling, rehearsing words I didn't know if I'd ever have the courage to say. They arrived late, as if time meant nothing, strolling in with hesitant smiles that felt rehearsed. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize them. The years had carved lines into their faces, but the same old air of casual dismissal lingered. They hugged me like no years had passed, like no betrayal had been committed. My body stiffened. I didn't return the embrace. The small talk was unbearable. They spoke of weather, traffic, trivial things, dancing around the abyss between us. Finally, I cut through the charade. Why? The word snapped out sharper than I intended, but it was the only question that mattered. Their eyes darted, searching for an answer they could live with. And then the excuses began. We thought you'd be fine, they said, as if a teenager abandoned overnight could somehow be expected to flourish. They spoke of a fresh start, of circumstances beyond control, of how difficult things had been for them. Every excuse felt like salt in an open wound, each word minimizing the years of loneliness I endured. I couldn't stop myself. The rage that I had buried under success and discipline spilled out. You left me with nothing, I hissed. No warning, no plan, not even the decency of goodbye. You didn't think I'd be fine. You didn't think about me at all. The cafe seemed to go silent around us, the air heavy with words that had waited 12 years to be spoken. They tried to soften their tone, leaning on phrases like, we did what we had to do, and you're stronger because of it. That last line cut deepest. They wanted to claim my resilience as proof they hadn't failed me, as though the scars I carried were some kind of justification for their cruelty. My hands shook under the table as I fought back the urge to scream. Every memory I had locked away came flooding back. Nights on strangers' couches, the gnawing hunger of empty days, the humiliation of begging for work. I told them about it all, not sparing a detail. Their faces shifted from discomfort to defensiveness, as if my suffering was an accusation they weren't prepared to face. But I didn't stop. They needed to hear it. At one point, one of them whispered, "We thought you'd understand when you were older." The words made my chest constrict. Understand? What was there to understand about being discarded like garbage? I realized then that they hadn't come to apologize. They had come to rewrite the story, to make themselves the victims of difficult choices, not the villains of calculated abandonment. The more they spoke, the more I saw how little had changed. They weren't sorry. They weren't remorseful. They wanted absolution without accountability. They wanted the comfort of family ties without facing the devastation they had caused. And in that realization, something inside me hardened. Forgiveness might have been possible, but not while they refused to own the truth. When I finally stood to leave, My voice was steady, though my heart was breaking all over again. You didn't lose me because you left, I said quietly. You lost me because you never came back, not until you needed something. And that's not family. That's convenience. I walked out, leaving them at the table, their excuses hanging in the air like smoke. For the first time, I felt the power shift. I was no longer the abandoned child. I was the one walking away. After the confrontation, I thought I had walked away for good. But it wasn't over. The messages started almost immediately. Texts, emails, voicemails filled with shaky voices asking me not to give up on them. They shifted from defensive to desperate, no longer justifying the past but pleading for a future. We're still family, they kept repeating, as if those words alone could erase 12 years of silence. Every message tore at me. Family had always been a wound I carried, one that shaped who I became. A part of me still longed for what I had missed: Sunday dinners, shared holidays, even the small comfort of belonging somewhere. The idea of having that again, even broken and imperfect, was tempting. But another part of me recoiled at the thought of letting them back in. What if they betrayed me again? What if this time it wasn't just my life at stake, but everything I had built? I thought of my home now, the walls I paid for, the career I carved from nothing, the people in my life who had become my chosen family. They knew me, supported me, celebrated my victories without resentment. Letting my blood family back in felt like opening the door to a storm that could rip apart the fragile peace I had earned. Still, guilt whispered in the back of my mind. Weren't we taught that blood is thicker than water? Weren't we told that family, no matter how flawed, should always be given another chance? Yet I couldn't ignore the truth. When I had needed them most, they had chosen themselves. And now, years later, they only reached out because I was whole enough to be worth something again. Their pleas became emotional bargains. We've changed. We're older now. We regret everything. Some messages even hinted at practical needs: financial help, connections, support. That revelation stung most of all. Was reconciliation truly their goal, or was I just a resource they wanted to claim? The thought turned my stomach, making every apology feel hollow. I wrestled with the decision night after night, lying awake in the quiet hours, staring at the ceiling. Part of me wanted to believe in forgiveness, in second chances. But forgiveness without accountability was just surrender. And I had not fought all these years to surrender the life I built for myself. One evening, I drafted a message and deleted it 20 times before finally pressing send. It wasn't cruel, but it was clear. I told them I had built a life without them, and that life mattered more than reopening wounds for people who had never owned their actions. I wished them well, but I told them not to contact me again until they could truly understand what they had done. Not just to the teenager they abandoned, but to the adult I became in spite of it. The silence that followed was both heavy and liberating. Days passed without replies. Weeks stretched into months. Sometimes I felt pangs of loneliness, wondering if I had chosen isolation over healing. But then I'd look at the life around me, the laughter of friends, the stability of my home, the strength in my own reflection. And I knew I had chosen protection, not punishment. In the end, I realized family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by loyalty, by love, by the willingness to stand together when it's hardest. My blood family had abandoned me once. My chosen family never had. The decision was painful, but it was clear. Boundaries were the only way forward, and so I let go, not of the pain, because pain lingers, but of the obligation to fix what I didn't break. I chose myself, my future, and the people who had earned a place in it. For the first time, the weight of abandonment wasn't crushing me. It was behind me, where it belonged. In the quiet after their absence, I found myself finally breathing without waiting for the next blow. It was strange, like stepping out of a storm you've lived in so long you'd forgotten how silence feels. For years, I carried the weight of their choices like a stone strapped to my chest. But now, with distance and boundaries firmly in place, I realized the stone was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to them, and they could shoulder it themselves. I began to see my survival for what it truly was. Not just endurance, but transformation. I had been a 17-year-old left behind with nothing but a note that said, "You'll figure it out." And I had. I had figured out how to work, how to survive, how to climb when no one was there to catch me. That wasn't weakness. That was strength born from abandonment, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel proud of it. Healing didn't come in dramatic waves, but in small, steady moments. Cooking dinner in my own kitchen, laughing with friends who showed up for me time and again, walking into a job I had earned through sheer grit. Every moment of stability felt like stitching a wound closed from the inside. I wasn't healed entirely, but I was no longer bleeding. I also realized that family doesn't have to be the people who share your DNA. It can be the neighbor who checked in on me when I was struggling. It can be the friend who lent me $50 when I had nothing. It can be the colleague who celebrated my promotions louder than anyone else. Blood had abandoned me, but chosen bonds had carried me through. That was family. There were nights when I wondered if reconciliation might someday be possible. Maybe time could soften them. Maybe reflection could change them. But I no longer built my life around that maybe. If they truly wanted to make amends, the door wasn't locked. It was just guarded by my boundaries. They would have to earn their way in, and for once, I would be the one setting the terms. The greatest shift was internal. I no longer felt the same desperation for their approval. For years, every achievement I made had been shadowed by the thought, will they finally see me now? But now I realized their blindness wasn't my failure. Their silence wasn't my shame. I was already seen by the people who mattered and by myself most of all. With that clarity, I began building something more enduring than forgiveness: dignity. Dignity meant refusing to diminish myself to fit their narrative. It meant protecting the life I had fought for, even if that meant permanent distance. Dignity meant not needing to explain myself to those who had chosen to walk away first. Looking back, I saw my story not as one of abandonment, but of survival. I had been tested in the cruelest way, and I had not only survived, I had built. The scars were still there, but scars don't only mark pain. They also mark healing. Each one was proof that I was stronger than the silence they left me in. So I chose to close this chapter on my own terms. Whether they returned or disappeared forever, I would not let them define me again. My worth wasn't theirs to grant or take away. It had been mine all along. And in that truth, I found something even better than reconciliation: freedom. The note they left at 17 had said, "You'll figure it out." And they were right, though not in the way they intended. I had figured it out. I had figured out who I was without them, what I deserved, and where I was going. And in that discovery, I finally became whole. Not because they came back, but because I learned I never truly needed them in the first place.